I request our chairpersons to kindly introduce our speaker.
CV, please.
CV and topic.
The topic for this session will be hepatogenous diabetes emerging concepts.
नहीं हम जिस आप बहुत देते हैं
So, good morning everybody. So this is the second day of our annual conference. Welcome all of you. The topic of first talk is the emerging diabetes management, and we have very eminent speaker with us, Dr. Vijay Kumar, who is also co-chair Scientific Committee RSSDI Bihar Chapter Annual Conference. He is additional professor, Department of Medicine at AIIMS Patna, and he has very good academic and literally exposure. So all to Dr. Vijay.
Good morning. Thank you, chairpersons, for nice introduction. Good morning, respected senior faculties, friends. Today the topic which I have selected is certainly debatable one, because I know I am opening a Pandora box, because till date hepatogenous diabetes is not a separate entity. Even American Diabetes Association and of course RSSDI also does not recognize it as a separate entity. But because they say the concept of hepatogenous diabetes is the diabetes should develop after chronic liver disease or after cirrhosis of liver. So that is the...
I request our chairpersons to kindly introduce our speaker.
CV, please.
CV and topic.
The topic for this session will be hepatogenous diabetes emerging concepts.
नहीं हम जिस आप बहुत देते हैं
So, good morning everybody. So this is the second day of our annual conference. Welcome all of you. The topic of first talk is the emerging diabetes management, and we have very eminent speaker with us, Dr. Vijay Kumar, who is also co-chair Scientific Committee RSSDI Bihar Chapter Annual Conference. He is additional professor, Department of Medicine at AIIMS Patna, and he has very good academic and literally exposure. So all to Dr. Vijay.
Good morning. Thank you, chairpersons, for nice introduction. Good morning, respected senior faculties, friends. Today the topic which I have selected is certainly debatable one, because I know I am opening a Pandora box, because till date hepatogenous diabetes is not a separate entity. Even American Diabetes Association and of course RSSDI also does not recognize it as a separate entity. But because they say the concept of hepatogenous diabetes is the diabetes should develop after chronic liver disease or after cirrhosis of liver. So that is the main concept of hepatogenous diabetes. Diabetes should develop after or as a consequence of chronic liver disease. Usually diabetes develops in patients of chronic liver disease, but the time when diabetes develops, early or later, is usually not demarcated. That's why the term hepatogenous diabetes has been coined, though it has been coined very early, but it has not gained its popularity. So in next 15 minutes, I will try to highlight the salient features and why it is different, or why it should be taken as different entity, and it's up to you to decide whether it should be taken as separate entity or not. So outline of my talk will be, I will define what is hepatogenous diabetes, certain characteristics, specific characteristics of hepatogenous diabetes, how it is different from classical type 2 diabetes, its epidemiology, some pathophysiology, not in detail, some salient features, and how should we manage it. So that is the total gist of the talk. Now some people say that खरबूजा के ऊपर चाकू रहे या चाकू के ऊपर खरबूजा रहे, कटेगा तो खरबूजा ही. But here the story is different. If diabetes develops earlier, then the story is different, and if diabetes develops after development of chronic liver disease, then the story is somewhat different. So with this background, usually prevalence of diabetes in chronic liver disease or cirrhotic patients is much higher than in the general population. This is the data, and two types of diabetes are usually seen. One is classical type 2 diabetes and another is hepatogenous diabetes, which I am going to discuss. So the term was coined in 1906 by Nonin and later on also by other researchers, but the term did not get attention as the entity was then poorly understood. So for hepatogenous diabetes to be diagnosed, diabetes must have occurred after the onset of cirrhosis or after the onset of chronic liver disease. That is the prerequisite for hepatogenous diabetes. However, in practice, it is somewhat challenging to differentiate whether diabetes developed earlier or cirrhosis developed earlier, in some cases. So association between diabetes and liver cirrhosis is bidirectional, and as patients with type 2 diabetes can develop NAFLD, which may progress to cirrhosis of liver. And certain etiological agents like alcohol, NAFLD, hepatitis C viruses, hemochromatosis, they have a direct diabetogenic effect which can lead to diabetes even before onset of cirrhosis, posing a classification dilemma. That's why a consensus-based criteria for defining hepatogenous diabetes in liver cirrhosis patients needed in order to ensure consistency in future clinical research. So what are the characteristics? It should occur after the onset of liver cirrhosis, normal fasting glycemia, but abnormal oral glucose tolerance test. That's why there is a diagnostic dilemma also. If we measure the fasting blood sugar, then usually we can miss. So in cases of hepatogenous diabetes or in those cases, we need to do oral glucose tolerance test. Of course, remission should be there after a renal transplantation, and there should be higher association with the severity of liver cirrhosis and liver-related complications. So, how it is different from classical type 2 diabetes? In type 2 diabetes, raised fasting blood sugar and A1C are common findings, as we all know, whereas in hepatogenous diabetes, usually they have normal fasting glucose with abnormal oral glucose tolerance test. And of course, ratio of postprandial blood sugar to fasting blood sugar, fasting blood insulin and insulin resistance are significantly higher in hepatogenous diabetes than those with classical type 2 diabetes. The prevalence of microvascular and macrovascular complications are much lower in these entities as compared to classical type 2 diabetes or diabetes with liver disease. So cause of death is usually liver-related complications in hepatogenous diabetes, while in type 2 diabetes there are other complications which are the cause of death in those cases. So in nutshell, hepatogenous diabetes, the onset should be after cirrhosis of liver. Presentation is usually subclinical and usually diagnosed by oral glucose tolerance test. Hypoglycemia, chances of hypoglycemia is more, and metformin associated lactic acidosis is usually higher in these cases. Effect of orthotopic liver transplantation is usually reversal. Traditional risk factors are less frequently present. Complications are lower. Complications of liver disease are higher, and mortality is higher than in non-diabetic cirrhotic subjects. Coming to the epidemiology, prevalence is usually more in cirrhotic patients than in general population. These are the data in NAFLD leading to cirrhosis. The Incidence or prevalence is 56%, in cryptogenic cirrhosis 51%, and in hepatitis C and V virus related cirrhosis, the prevalence of hepatogenous diabetes is 32 and 22.2%. Prevalence of diabetes as per the Child-Pugh criteria in A, B, C, as the complication or as the severity of chronic liver disease increases, the prevalence goes higher, and in Child-Pugh C classification group, the prevalence is 61.2%. So the prevalence is usually related with the severity of the chronic liver disease. Coming to the diagnosis part, diagnosis is usually being done, as I have already emphasized, diagnosis is usually being done by oral glucose tolerance test, and if we do only fasting blood sugar or sometimes A1C only, then in those cases we certainly miss the diagnosis. This is the table showing these researchers, they have used only fasting blood sugar. In those cases, they were able to diagnose in only 27%, and when they used both fasting blood sugar and oral glucose tolerance test, then they were able to diagnose diabetes in 48%. So this is the data which usually emphasizes that to combine or at least oral glucose tolerance test should be done in those cases to diagnose or to identify the submerged population. Coming to the pathophysiology, hyperinsulinemia, pancreatic dysfunction, reduced incretin effects, gut dysbiosis, hyperammonemia, sarcopenia, and the prevalence or the raised level of hepatokines and adipokines, they are the most common causating factors. Hyperinsulinemia, usually due to reduction in liver cell mass and presence of photosystemic collaterals in cirrhotic patients, they usually result in decreased extraction of insulin by the liver, leading to systemic hyperinsulinemia, and it can lead to insulin resistance through down-regulation of insulin receptors of target cells. There are reduced incretin effects in cases of chronic liver disease. The two naturally occurring incretins, they are usually gut-derived and are rapidly hydrolyzed by DPP-4, and the inactivation of GLP-1 results in the development of impaired glucose tolerance and hepatic steatosis. So, in nutshell, this is the pathophysiology. Ultimately, there is a insulin resistance and beta cell dysfunction leading to hepatogenous diabetes. Now, what are the challenges? Usually, for classical type 2 diabetes, there are certain other challenges, and when we are dealing the cases of hepatogenous diabetes, there are certain other challenges which we should highlight or which we should emphasize. One is lack of concrete guidelines, pathophysiological changes in the body due to cirrhosis, alteration in pharmacokinetic properties of OHA rendering patients to increased risk of adverse events, lifestyle modifications or some lifestyle changes. They are usually very restrictive because patients of chronic liver disease, they are moribund and they are very reluctant for any sort of physical activity. So physical activity cannot be encouraged in those patients. Physical exercise which improves insulin resistance may not be advisable for patients with chronic liver disease due to ongoing liver inflammation. Alterations in hepatic blood flow also causes altered pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics of OHAs, alteration in fluid distribution, low level of plasma proteins causing, because most of the OHA they are plasma protein bound, so low level of plasma protein again causes alteration in pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics of those drugs, altered intestinal mucosal permeability and altered gut flora. So these are the challenges while managing these cases. Renal impairment leading to accumulation of drugs or its metabolites. When in patients of chronic liver disease due to hepatorenal syndrome, there might be renal impairment leading to accumulation of drugs, loss of hepatic mass and photosystemic shunting causing reduced insulin clearance, free plasma concentration of protein-bound drugs increased due to hypoalbuminemia, and role of liver in lactate metabolism may precipitate lactic acidosis by use of biguanides. So these are certain challenges while managing type 2 hepatogenous diabetes. Again, OHA associated hepatotoxicity are there, so we have to be cautious while using certain OHA in patients of chronic liver disease or in patients of hepatogenous diabetes, that I will discuss later on. Variable and unpredictable requirement of insulin again is a major challenge. Fasting blood sugar and A1C are unreliable for monitoring of glycemic control in those cases, and non-reversal of diabetes following liver transplantation in 1/3 due to persistent dysfunction of pancreatic beta cells. So these are the challenges. Coming to the treatment armamentarium or treatment modalities, how should we classify or how should we modify the medications? Coming to the biguanides, they are the best insulin sensitizer. Plasma protein binding is negligible. Hepatic metabolism is insignificant. That's why they are also the presumed risk of lactic acidosis, though it is very low. So clinical experience in cirrhotic patients are widely available, so they can be used rampantly or they can be used very comfortably. Low risk of hypoglycemia is also there. But coming to the sulfonylureas, as they are highly protein bound and metabolic, they are dependent on liver for their metabolism. So elimination route is of course renal, but there are high risk of hypoglycemia, so they are usually not preferred in cirrhotic patients or patients with chronic liver disease. Coming to the thiazolidinediones, there are limited clinical experience in cirrhotic patients. Weight gain may be a problematic. That's why they are also to be avoided. DPP-4 inhibitors, their favorable pharmacokinetic properties in cirrhotic patients, again they are the preferable agent for management of diabetes in chronic liver disease or in hepatogenous diabetes. As the plasma protein binding is low, hepatic metabolism is insignificant except in cases of saxagliptin. So except saxagliptin, all other DPP-4 inhibitors, they can be used comfortably. Coming to the alpha-glucosidase inhibitors, acarbose, they delay absorption of carbohydrate, plasma protein binding is again negligible, hepatic metabolism is again negligible, so they are safe in cirrhotic patients as per the clinical experience or as per the clinical data. SGLT2 inhibitors, they are mostly plasma protein bound. They have a hepatic metabolism, extensive hepatic metabolism, but they are favorable pharmacokinetic properties in cirrhotic patients, so they are also being used comfortably. So in nutshell, biguanides, they can be used very comfortably. Sulfonylurea, they should be avoided. Thiazolidinediones, they should be avoided. DPP-4 inhibitors can be used. SGLT2 inhibitors can be used in hepatogenous diabetes. So factors affecting selection of OHAs: in background of obesity, metformin, SGLT2 inhibitors and GLP-1 agonists, they should be preferred. DPP-4 inhibitors are weight neutral, so may be considered, but sulfonylurea, pioglitazone and insulin, they usually promote weight gain, and we should consider for alternative for these agents. In cases of sarcopenia, metformin and thiazolidinediones, they appear to have favorable effect on muscle mass, so they should be preferred. And SGLT2 inhibitors or sulfonylurea may increase the risk of sarcopenia, so they should be usually avoided. In cases of renal impairment, insulin and linagliptin appear to be safe. In cases of hypoglycemia or in cases of those who are more prone to develop hypoglycemia, in those insulin should be avoided. Insulin and sulfonylurea should be avoided because the high risk of hypoglycemia. Metformin, pioglitazones or thiazolidinediones, they should be preferred. So coming to the treatment algorithm based on the Child-Pugh criteria, for Child-Pugh A and B, usually the treatment is almost similar, but in Child-Pugh B, the treatment should be used with caution, and in Child A cirrhosis, usually we should start with metformin, and as per the requirement or as per the fasting blood sugar, PP and other things, they can be titrated, and it can be again alpha glucosidase inhibitors, DPP4 inhibitors or SGLT2 inhibitors. They can be added depending on the requirement. But in cases of child C cirrhosis, usually we should start right from insulin, and we should not take any risk for take other oral hypoglycemic agents. So in nutshell, hepatogenous diabetes is an underdiagnosed disease which is still poorly understood, should always be considered in patients with cirrhosis, and deserves further investigations. They usually present with normal fasting plasma glucose, normal A1C levels, and requiring an oral glucose tolerance test for diagnosis. An attempt should be made to differentiate between type 2 diabetes and hepatogenous diabetes based on the presence or absence of classical risk factors of type 2 diabetes or a simple OGTT. Patients with hepatogenous diabetes should be carefully followed up in view of the increased risk of hepatic decompensation, mortality and hepatocellular carcinoma. Because of the lack of clear guidelines for treatment, therapy should be individualized and should start with metformin. Differentiating hepatogenous diabetes from classical type 2 diabetes may be relevant for both prognostic and therapeutic purposes. Thank you for patient hearing.
Wonderful presentation, a very lucid presentation, and thank you for enlightening us with a relatively new concept of hepatogenous diabetes. Diabetes is indeed a disease. More we are trying to learn, we feel that a lot of areas are still there which we don't know, and maybe tomorrow it will be clubbed under secondary diabetes. My question to you, before I open the house for question, Dr. Vijay,
Sir.
is that which will be your insulin of choice, and which will be the oral therapeutic agent of choice in an uncomplicated hepatogenous. I mean to say only hepatic problem is there and renal impairment and nothing is there. In those cases, what will be your preferred regimen?
Sir, as I already emphasized, that for child A and B, child A usually some comparatively uncomplicated one. So in child A, usually we should start with metformin, and we can go on titrating and adding SGLT2 inhibitors and alpha glucosidase inhibitors. Later on, if uncontrolled, then we should add insulin. Among insulin, for child C, B is gray zone, we can start here also. If not controlled or if leading to child C, then we should switch over to insulin. But in child C or complicated one, insulin is the choice of therapy, and of course regular insulin should be given. Because there is altered pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics.
Now, as such, since this is unstable condition,
Yes, sir.
and a lot of glycemic variability is
So we
there.
need frequent monitoring and frequent dose titration.
Shortest possible duration of action of insulin
Yes, sir.
will help us avoid it,
Exactly.
and maybe the short-acting analogs will be the most preferred lot along with
Yes, sir. Yes,
regular
sir. Well
insulin.
taken, sir. That is important.
Now the floor is open to the questions. Dr. Supriyo.
A wonderful presentation, Dr. Vijay.
Thank you, sir.
I wanted to ask you one question, that what is the incidence of heart failure in hepatogenous diabetes? What is the complication rate, if you have the knowledge or idea of? And secondly, what is the incidence of this heart failure, and if you treat with pioglitazone? Because pioglitazone would be a very good choice as far as hepatogenous diabetes is concerned. And what is the barrier of using pioglitazone in this group of patients?
Sir, hepatogenous diabetes per se, it usually not aggravates any incidence or prevalence of heart failure. First thing is that. But if there is coexistent heart failure, then in those cases, of course, pioglitazone should not be the first choice. The other agents are there. But in those cases, SGLT2 inhibitors, because that is a very good option in those cases. So in those cases, we should start with SGLT2 inhibitors. That will be a wise decision.
Maybe the Supriyo wanted to know whether liver of heart failure, they can also induce diabetes.
Yes, sir. In due course, of course, if chances of heart failure are there, so in those cases we should be cautious and we should avoid glitazones, of course, sir.
I think
Since there are no questions, any other comment? Sir? Okay.
Sir, one
That's-
question.
Okay. Please go ahead.
Good morning, sir. My question is to you, sir. In chronic liver disease and when it is in advanced stages, why shouldn't go for the basal insulin rather going for the regular insulin?
The answer is there, sir, already answered.
Because
That-
it has some stable course in the long-acting basal insulin that we have in the market.
As in cases of chronic liver disease, all drugs, they have altered pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics due to various factors. One important factor is altered plasma protein level, and most of the drugs, they are usually metabolized and eliminated through liver, and they are usually plasma protein bound. For altered pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics, we need short-acting drugs or short-acting insulin so that the dose can be titrated on frequent manner. That's why they are usually preferred.
If we use the sugar monitoring, continuous blood glucose monitoring system,
In our part, that is somewhat unpractical, but if CGM is there, then that can be used.
that can be used. Thank you, sir.
Altered metabolism means chances of hypoglycemia at any time is possible.
Yes, sir.
तो इंसुलिन फोबिया के चलते बच्चों में देना 3 peaks very difficult.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So you can give insulin degludec in a child,
Yes, sir. That
one dose and it will take the 24 hours or
Yes.
so. So I will advise degludec.
Thank you. Well taken, sir.
Okay, let us close the session now. Thank you, Vijay, for wonderful presentation.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. I request our chairpersons to please felicitate the speaker. For the next session, I request Dr. Ajoy Kumar sir and Dr. Rizwan Haider sir to please come up on the stage as the chairpersons. The topic for the next session is early onset of type 2 diabetes, pitfalls and perils. I request our chairpersons to please introduce the speaker to us.
The second topic is early onset of type 2 diabetes and its pitfalls and perils. And the speaker who is going to elaborate this topic is Dr. Mahavir Thakur. Over to Mahavir Thakur.
Namaskar. At the outset, I would like to thank the whole organizing team of Bihar chapter and especially Professor S.C. Jha for giving me an opportunity to deliberate a talk. And second thing, where I am standing, this is my alma mater. I spent more than 10 years doing undergraduate, postgraduate and diploma. And not only that, I did intermediate from this local CM college. So altogether, I spent more than 12 years in this city. So when I entered this campus, a lot of nostalgia, lot of moments caught in my mind. Now coming to my topic, early onset of type 2 diabetes mellitus. The question is it different from adult late onset, and is it require special attention so far as management and diagnosis is concerned? I will discuss this in next 18 minutes, what are provided to me. The early onset type 2 diabetes is usually find as occurring below age of 40, but some people cover it up to 45 just to have capture the childbearing age of woman, that is up to 45 years. But there is no consistency of definition across the literature. But this having less than pediatric, less than 19 years, and more than 19 years up to 40 to 45 years. So what are the risk factors? That's early onset of diabetes. Overweight, obesity, sedentary lifestyle, low socioeconomic status, and ethnicity. Asians are more prone to have early onset. And then the strong family history, and both parents are suffering from diabetes, even late onset diabetes. The children are more prone to have early onset. History of gestational diabetes and PCOD is one of the important, and in utero exposure to type 2 diabetes mellitus and low birth weight. These are the risk factors. It is driven, type 2 diabetes early on young age, driven by obesity. If the young adult is obese, they have diabetes at the early stage. So, this is one question to the floor. What is the average onset of type 2 diabetes in India as per your clinical experience? 25 years, 35 years, 45 years, or 55 years?
Good afternoon. Diabetic foot, what a physician need to know. I think this is a very, very pertinent topic if you are practicing diabetes. I invite Dr. Rajneesh Saxena. All the...
Sir, I will introduce myself because my flight is at 1 o'clock.
Oh, thank you, Dr.
Actually, I think the foot is always neglected part of the body. That's why I want to finish very as early as can.
So from the city of, let me see something, from the city of Ajmer, a giant personality before you to talk on a very, very important topic. Dr. Saxena.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Good afternoon, friends. First of all, I am very much thankful to Dr. Subhash Kumar, Dr. Manish, Dr. Amit for giving me this opportunity and wonderful hospitality from the team BR RSJ. Thank you very much, sir. I will discuss very important topic, very painful, very expensive to manage and very troublesome complication of diabetes, that is diabetic foot. I will discuss only investigation part. You know, everything changed since years, not the trust, because your feet deserve the best, and for us, every feet is precious. Now, you know, at present there are more than 100 million people are suffering from diabetes mellitus, according to ICMR India B study. So, more than 200 million feet are at risk of developing diabetic foot problem, and prevalence of diabetic foot in our country is 7.4% to 15.3%. The lower extremity amputation expected in our country is more than 1 lakh. Previously it was supposed that it was 2 lakhs. Now, according to data of Indian Vascular Society of India, it is about more than 1 lakh amputation per year is recorded. Shockingly, only 50% amputees achieve mobility. And among diabetes patients, 15% experience a foot ulcer in their lifetime, and 15 to 20% of patients with such foot ulcer go on to need an amputation. But dedicated diabetic foot care result in 40 to 70% reduction in amputation. So proper diabetic foot care, diabetic foot education of the patient is very important to prevent the amputation. The impact you all know, in every 20 seconds one limb is lost due to some diabetes foot problem all around the world. So it is very important to educate all the patients to prevent diabetic foot problems. and it is very expensive problem. We have to spend more than 45% of the total amount which is needed to manage all diabetes and diabetes complication. So it is very expensive. It is not only create a problem for patient but also for our country. The disease pathology, you all know, mainly diabetic foot infection is a result of complex interplay between neuropathy, peripheral artery disease, foot deformities and infection. If patient come to you with cold and paler foot, then you easily diagnose that he is suffering from any vascular problem. Then if a patient is coming with insensitive foot, then sensory or motor neuropathy is there. Motor neuropathy indicates that there may be any deformity in the foot because of the alteration in the biomechanics of the foot, and hot and turgid foot due to autonomic neuropathy. So these all along with extrinsic trauma because of unsuitable footwear wear by the patient will be directly responsible for development of ulceration, and ultimately if this ulcer get infected, then there may be septic, or if neuropathy with ischemic changes are there, then neuroischemic foot will be at risk of developing. For saving the life of the patient, amputation is required. The significant risk factor for diabetic foot and foot ulceration, mainly loss of preventive sensation, history of amputation, mainly tobacco chewing, alcohol, dyslipidemia, elevated plantar pressure because of the inappropriate footwear, subjective symptoms of neuropathy, and mainly motor neuropathy is responsible for hallux rigidus, hallux valgus and toe deformity. If duration of diabetes is more than 10 years, and poor vision and CKD patients are also at risk of developing diabetic foot problem, and male sex is also very prone to develop diabetic foot. Then examination of foot. The goal of examination is to identify normal foot as risk, presence of significant neuropathy and ischemia, and lastly the presence of foot lesions. Then comprehensive foot examination and risk assessment, it is very important because from the day of our first MBBS we are educated for history taking. So history taking part is very important. Always go for past history of any ulceration, amputation, Charcot arthropathy, vascular surgery, angioplasty, smoking or tobacco chewing, diminution of vision and CKD. These all are very important to take at the time of history taking. Then general inspection of the foot, not only from the plantar aspect but also from the dorsal aspect.
Welcome Dr. Sher Singh Daria. Where is he? Yeah,
I am here.
Yeah, Sher Singh Daria is a very actual Sher in his own words. So he is going to present something related to diabetes. Go ahead. You have only 15 minutes.
Yeah, thank you so much. And because of paucity of time, we have to catch the flight, and our flight is at 1:15. So forgive me for if I am running fast. So let's start. Almost half already covered by Dr. Rajni Saxena. So there is no conflicts of interest. As he already said that lifetime risk is 25% of DFU, and more than 50% of non-traumatic lower extremity amputations are 85% of all lower extremity amputation in diabetic are preceded by the DFU. It's started with infection, then ulceration, and ultimately leads to destruction of tissue. It severely affects the livelihood of around 6% of diabetic patients in India, and 1/3 of diabetic foot disease require the amputations. Most common site is the plantar surface. These are the risk factors: the neuropathy, the PVD, the trauma, foot deformity, limb mobility, and duration of diabetes with other poor vision and old age. This is the etiological triad. They start from the ischemia, the neuropathy, and the infection. The complex mechanism with the polyol pathway, hexamine pathway, and advanced and glycation product, which ultimately finally increase risk of shear pressure and injury, leads to the foot ulcer-borne infections. This is the best slide according to me to see approach about the diabetic foot infections, and these are the A, B, C. A is for assessment, advice and assess. B is for blood pressure maintenance, control of infection, debridement and dressings, education, which is very important in diabetic ulcers, footwear and fluid retention, and the Gaussian drugs. This is the ABAC performa. The protocol
assessment at initial and annual clinic visit. If there is no problem identified, continue ABC, give advice on smoking, trauma avoidance, sensible foot care. If problems identified, then refer urgently to a foot clinic, and then there is a neurovascular assessment, offloading, the treatment of infection, debridement, and regular follow-up with until healing. This is the evaluation multidisciplinary foot care team, the clinical presentation, history about the onset and progression of ulcer. Past medical history is very important because there is a chance of recurrent diabetic foot infections. If there is a recurrence, then the amputation rate is increased. This is the physical examination of ulcers, the size, depth, color and position. The neuropathic foot ulcers are normally warm with palpable pulses. The skin may be dry and prone to fissure. In ischemia, there is a cool, pulseless, skin is thin, shiny and without hair. The intermittent claudication is presented and infected. We all know. These are the examination where we have to probe for the extension if there is a bone and sinus tract joint tendon sheath involvement, the type of discharge, the size, length, margin, color, odor, base of floor. For vascularity, see the palpation, capillary return, the color changes of ischemia and ABI. The neurological assessment by the vibration perception, pressure touch, pinprick and temperature perception by the hot and cold. Already discussed by Dr. Saxena that these are the monofilament tests. There are 9 plantar sites where we have to see all these monofilament use. The musculoskeletal deformities with the Charcot foot, the limited joint mobility, active and passive movements, the evaluation of skin and nails of the foot with the appearance, if there are any calluses, heel fissures, cracking of skin, appearance of your nail, presence of hair, ulceration, gangrene and infection. The classification given by the one is by the Wagner's classification for diabetic foot ulcer, and they grade up from 0 to grade 5 and 0 to 1 to 3 grade. The ulcers are termed as a non-gangrenous ulcers, and the last 2 are the termed as a gangrenous ulcer. Another classification by the University of Texas, which include with the grading and the staging. Grade from 0 to 3 and staging from A to D. For workup, start with the biochemistry with the HbA1c, fasting, CBC, SR, CRP. Then in imaging, already discussed by Dr. Saxena, assessment, plantar foot. So come to the final treatment. Aim is to revascularize surgical and conservative wound debridement and eradication of the infection. And the essential steps to preserve the moist, non-infected wound are treat the underlying cause, control ischemia, infection, debride the wound, dress the wound and offload the foot. For the debridement, if grade 3 or greater ulcers, then we should have to debride. And for goals of wound care, to provide the moist environment, absorb the exudate, act as a barrier and offload pressure at the ulcers. These are the types. This is a busy strand which are giving different type of dressings available in the market with the transparent films, hydrogels, foam, hydrocolloids, calcium alginate and gauze pads, and the indication are for a different from dry to minimal or the moderate, large, exudate, clean wound surfaces. The reduction of plantar pressure. Most important part is offloading. We use generally total contact cast, that is the gold standard, and removable walking braces with rocker bottom sole, total contact orthosis, the half shoe and wedge shoe and healing sandals. For vascular management, reconstruction surgery should be performed prior to definitive surgical management, and in surgical management to reduce or remove bony performance, they are treated surgically to effect the healing and to prevent the recurrences. This is the foot infection where the non-limb threatening and limb threatening infection, ulcer, the organism. You can see that if mild to moderate infection that can arise from the sketches, small punctures, fissures, that is non-limb threatening. And if there is a severe gangrene, necrotizing fasciitis and abscess may be present, then this is the limb threatening. The local signs, granulation tissue become increasingly friable, base of ulcer become the moist and changes from healthy pink granulation to the yellowish or grey tissue, discharge changes from clear to purulent and unpleasant odor is present. This is non-limb threatening. In limb threatening, the surgical treatment with the debridement of wounds and necrotizing fasciitis, incision and drainage abscess and amputation of gangrenous tissue. That should be taken deep from the wound, sent for the aerobic and anaerobic cultures. Osteomyelitic bones are removed and sent for the microbiological culture and the histology. Antibiotics should be started with an empiric regime, then sent to the culture. After the cultures, you can change the empiric therapy. That should be, the empiric therapy should be broad spectrum and given IV, whereas minor infection, you can start with the narrow spectrum antibiotics. In mild and moderate non-limb threatening infection, they are usually non-microbial. And if there is a microbial, then the common are the Staph aureus, epidermidis and streptococci. For polymicrobial, include the gram-positive and negative organisms, anaerobic and enterococci. Pseudomonas species isolated from wounds treated with the wet dressings. Enterococci, who previously received cephalospin, may be there. Anaerobes in deep wounds with necrosis and MRSA often acquired during previous hospitalization. Adjust according to culture sensitivity empiric therapy. If recurrent, then exclude the superinfection. If MRSA is isolated, should be treated early and appropriately. The duration in mild to moderate, you can give for 1 to 2 weeks. If there is a serious infection, then more than 2 weeks. For osteomyelitis, if bone is infected and not removed, antibiotic should be given for a longer period, 6 to 8 weeks. If all infected bone is removed, then you can keep for 1 to 2 weeks. The maintaining effectiveness of therapy through the patient parameters, clinical response, your WBC count, ESR, other inflammatory markers. This is the classification of infection: uninfected, no antibiotic, mild, oral, moderate to severe, oral and IV. This is the all I already told you, the gram-positive, the common causes of DFY. These are the suggested empiric antibiotic regime monitoring parameters. For mild, you can start the amox, clavulanic, cephalexin, clinda, dicloxacin, and in moderate to severe, there is cefotaxime, ceftriaxone, ciprofloxacin, ertapenem. In MRSA, the linezolid is very good and vancomycin is also again good. In Pseudomonas aeruginosa, aztreonam and cefepime. And MRSA enterobacteriaceae, you can use the daptomycin, linezolid and vancomycin. So prevention of diabetic foot care, there are 4 essentials: patient education, foot, skin and toenail care, protective footwear and protective surgeries. For foot care, you have to ask your patients that they have to wash your feet daily, dry your feet well, keep the skin soft, inspect your feet every day, ask your diabetes care team how you should care for your toenail, wear clean and soft socks, keep your feet warm and dry, never walk barefoot, keep your feet warm and examine your shoes every day. So how to do an annual foot checkup: remove shoes and socks, stockings, test foot sensation, palpate your foot pulses, inspect for any deformity, for significant callus, check for signs of ulceration. If any previous ulceration, then that should be referred to the podiatrist. So friends, foot problems are preventable and most foot problems are through the early identification, prompt treatment by skilled health clinician can be prevented. So to conclude, multidisciplinary approach team including podiatric and vascular surgeons to physician dealing with the medicine aspect of diabetes, wound care and infection. High morbidity and cost is there and it's going to be an increasing problem because as told by yesterday evening Dr. B.B. Thakur sir, that diabetes is not a single problem. Diabetes is a family problem. So education alone may effectively reduce the incidence of DFU and the rate of amputation. So most feet can be spared at least for a while. Thank you everyone for your patience here.
Thank you so much, sir, for your kind deliberation. It is an honor to listen to you here. And I'm really happy that you finished much before time. I know that you have to catch a flight, so in the interest of time.
I am sorry for that because of paucity of time I have to catch the flight, so
and,
I was very fast.
We will not be taking any questions for that. Sir has to catch a flight.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, team.
Thank you so much, sir.
Bihar and Darbhanga people who are listening. Thank you, everybody.
I request our chairpersons to please felicitate the speaker. For the next session on hypoglycemia, which remains a clinical challenge in diabetic care, I request Dr. Subhash Kumar sir and Dr. Atul sir to please come up on the stage as the chairpersons. I also request Dr. Subhash Kumar sir to please come up on the stage. I'm sorry, the topic for this session is Approach to Diabetes in Young, a Global Challenge. I request our chairpersons to please introduce the speaker to the gathering.
Good morning, everyone. Yeah, the topic was little swift, so the right topic is announced. And to introduce Dr. Arvind Jagdish, I should not say he's a person of excellence in diabetes. He has worked throughout the country for the awareness of diabetes. He has been known for his
I request our chairpersons to please invite and introduce the speaker to the audience.
So the next topic is going to be of very much clinical importance, that is the UTI and GTI infection with SGLT2 inhibitors. And the speaker is none other than Dr. Akash Singh from Ahmedabad. So I request Dr. Akash Singh sir to kindly come on the dais and take over the lecture.
Thank you. I will be presenting Genius study. I thank the chairpersons for calling me here, and I thank Dr. Manish Prasad, Dr. Sudhir Jha, and the entire team for calling me here for this presentation. Now, to set the background for this Genius study, SGLT2 inhibitors are presently the star in the treatment of type 2 diabetes. They address heart failure, nephropathy, CV disease, and a host of other metabolic risk factors. They are associated with a higher rate of GTIs than other anti-diabetic drugs. However, differences in the incidence of UTIs between SGLT2 inhibitors and other anti-diabetic drugs are inconsistently reported. So there is a lot of controversy. Some studies say that their incidence is not on the higher side. Some studies say that the incidence is on the higher side. Now, they increase urinary glucose excretion up to 90 grams per day. Average daily volume of urinary glucose excretion is 30 grams per liter, which is roughly equivalent to that of Sabrad agar, the preferred growth medium for the optimum yeast culture, providing a biological plausible explanation for observed increased incidence of GTA with SGLT2 inhibitors. Now, there are several mechanisms of increased risk: increased adherence of Candida to the genital tract, reduced host immune response in patients with type 2, especially with the longer duration, glycosuria due to SGLT2 inhibitor therapy, pre-existing anatomical abnormalities of urogenital tract, which are also very important to look into if patients develops GTA. Now, the factors which precipitate is poor genital hygiene. If symptoms of urogenital infections, the patient fails to report to the doctor, or the doctor fails to detect that SGLT is going on, the condition may be aggravated, and if adequate hydration is not taken, all of these can also increase the risk of GTA. So, the duration of diabetes, this was one study where they studied the factors associated with GTA, and they found out that duration of diabetes more than 10 years, overweight, obese patients, uncontrolled diabetes, a lower eGFR, and previous history of UTI, GTA, all predisposing to increased rate of GTA with SGLT2 inhibitors. Now, these are the facts. Meta-analysis show 4 to 8-fold increase risk of GMI in patients taking SGLT2 inhibitors compared to placebo or other hypoglycemic agents. Meta-analysis of multiple RCTs and more than 50,000 individuals did not find increases of UTI using SGLT2 versus placebo. No difference has been demonstrated amongst SGLT2 inhibitors. Hormonal changes during menopause are related to diminished immunity in the female reproductive tract, which increases the chances of genital infections. Circumcision reduces the risk of genital infections. Now, if you see various studies with dapagliflozin, canagliflozin, empagliflozin, you will clearly note that these studies basically show a very, very variable incidence of GTA, UTA, and these are varying between the groups. So, there is no clear-cut consensus on this parameter of UTA, GTA with SGLT2 inhibitors. Now there is another thing that it was noted in some studies that adding DPP-4 with SGLT inhibitors basically reduces the risk of GTI and UTI, and this was reality or hype. And this was a study basically which studied the relative risk of urinary tract infections with SGLT inhibitors plus DPP-4 inhibitors compared with placebo plus DPP-4 inhibitors, and you can see that simultaneous administration of SGLT DPP-4 was numerically better than if SGLT inhibitor was used alone or if DPP-4 was added to SGLT2 inhibitors later on. So the risk of genital infections has been found increased in sequential combination subgroup, but not in the simultaneous combination subgroup. So there is some mechanism by which the DPP-4 along with SGLT2 has a protective effect on GTI incidence. So incidence of GTI infection favors the use of SGLT2 plus DPP-4 fixed drug combination. In conclusion, in RCTs and in large pharmacovigilance database, combination therapy with DPP-4 inhibitors appears to reduce the frequency of GTIs associated with SGLT2 inhibitors. This was the conclusion. Coming to the management, the perineal hygiene is very important. Washing of genital organs following urination or defecation. Women should be advised to wash from front to back. Uncircumcised males should retract the prepuce before wash. Use clean water for washing or mild soap if required. Alcohol-based disinfectant should not be used for washing, and therefore patient education about perineal hygiene should be taken as a preemptive measure for all diabetic patients irrespective of pediatric therapy. Now this is how the treatment of GTI is done, basically vulvovaginal candidiasis, and in a vast majority of patients the infection is uncomplicated. You can do away with single dose of fluconazole and topical antifungal therapy, but if it is a severe case, then fluconazole may be required to be continued for a longer time along with the topical agents. If it is a recurring vulvovaginal candidiasis, 10 to 14 days of therapy with topical agent followed by fluconazole 150 weekly for 6 months basically. So you have to give a longer therapy. Now restarting SGLT2 after UTI GTI. So these are the guidelines. The perineal hygiene should be maintained to prevent GTIs, and after 3 months of GTI-free status, patients with type 2 diabetes can be prescribed with SGLT2 inhibitors along with prophylactic antifungal coverage. SGLT2 inhibitors should be avoided in case of previous history of upper UTIs, complicated GTIs, or refractory or resistant GTIs. So all these are the facts which I have stated, but coming to the what transpired the conduction of this study, these are the real world happenings. Now there is a famous saying by Sherlock Holmes, there is nothing more deceptive than obvious fact. The obvious fact is that the SGLT2 inhibitors predispose the patient for UTI, GTI. So in CME and DIA group there was a discussion. This was published that SGLT2 inhibitors real world stories about UTI, GTI and failed patients. There was discussion on real life cases concerning SGLT2 inhibitors. Some interesting points emerged from the discussion. Now this
Now, we will request Dr. N.K. Singh, Dhanbad, to have a lecture on gut microbiota in diabetes mellitus.
Namaskar. Gut microbiota in diabetes. Just tune for next 15 minutes. This is a very, very interesting story which is developing. There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you. So let us proceed and see. So I will tell you, for next, if you look back, maybe 10 years back, it was something which no one was talking about. And today if you go in all of the international conferences of diabetes, lots of research papers are going on. Internet, if you search, a huge amount of data is there. and it is very, very complex subject. So make it very in the simple way. I will tell you what happens in type 2 diabetes with the alteration of the gut microbiome, and what are the microbial metabolites, very important, that is the role of the short chain bile acids and lipopolysaccharides, and how this is affecting your clinical practice. If you look back when there was entry of next generation sequencing in 2005, the birth of metagenomics, the ability to measure the vast community of microbiota in the human GI tract was not possible. But today, with understanding of the normal microbiome pattern, including what constitutes a healthy versus disease pattern, although I agree that it is still in the infancy, but still the huge data has accumulated. So remember, your gastrointestinal tract has a complex and distinct population of microorganisms that comprise the gut microbiota. And you know very well that your diet, your lifestyle can change the gut microbiota and influence the metabolism. This data, when I got aware, I think in ADA conference before COVID, and I heard saying someone that it is amazing that you are sitting here with around 1.5 to 2 kg of microbiota, which you are not knowing that if my body is suppose 70, maybe 1 kg it is microbiome or microbiota. So this is really very interesting. So today, the people are sampling their own feces for the purpose of science, taking probiotics, eating lots of the yogurt and other things like kimchi, and are trying to foster the good bacteria. And science is really exploding, and we are just in the early stage of making some sense of it. So if you see, it is not only related to the diabetes, it is related to so many diseases like gut lung axis, heart diseases, skin axis, metabolism, and so many things. The first thing which we should be aware that human gut microbiome consists of these things like Firmicutes, Bacteroidetes, and like Proteobacteria, Actinobacteria, Fusobacteria, and like that. So these are the few things which are very, very important. And only you remember the three chemicals, three things. One is short chain fatty acids, the acetate, butyrate, and the activation of the immune response by the toll-like receptors and the TAMO. So these three things are very important. And this is a film you can see that if you remember only four, the F, A, B and P, this is the सब खेला इसी का है कि कौन इसमें बढ़ जाता है, कौन घट जाता है. This पर depends on so many your health. So what we are seeing कि Firmicutes ये contain करता है 60 to 80%, Actinobacteria 20 to 30%, Bacteroides 10% and Proteobacter around less than 1%. अगर इस combination को आप derange कर दें, this becomes the gut dysbiosis. Very simple. So you can see here, one type of bacteria found in the gut may contribute to the development of type 2 diabetes, while another can protect you. So एक concept क्या नया है? If you see कि 2000 साल पहले Hippocrates said, all diseases begin in gut. A statement was accurately associated with immune system dysregulation and susceptible to disease. But हमारे वैदिक साइंस में अगर 5000 साल पहले आप अपने को देखें तो वहाँ से बोला गया था कि आपकी सारी बीमारी का जड़ जो है वो आपका पेट है, और आज साइंस इसको प्रूफ कर रहा है. So in 2025, I told you how the gut microbiota and how they are differ in intestinal homeostasis. I am showing the dysbiosis, but we have got the evidence, but this is important to tell you the long story short, that if the Proteobacteria or Bacteroides increase, there is dysbiosis, and then the Firmicutes decrease. In the same way, if you are looking at profile of inflammatory bowel disease, type 2 diabetes, necrotizing enterocolitis, the pattern of this microbiota is again different. And today, the mounting details of this stage, the changes in the human genome, dietary habits, और ओनली रिडक्शन इन डेली फिजिकल एक्टिविटी, आप यही बोलते हो कि आपका या तो डाइट खराब है, आपकी एक्टिविटी खराब है और आपका जेनेटिक प्रॉब्लम है तो डायबिटीज हो रहा है. दिस इज नॉट द टोटल स्टोरी. दिस मे बी everything is being related with this gut microbiota. This slide is very important that many treatment options target the microbiota today, and there is a bi-directional relationship between diabetes and the gut microbiota. Some sort of microbiota increasing, some sort of decreasing, leading to gut microbial dysbiosis, the lipopolysaccharides increasing, there is metabolic endotoxemia, inflammation, insulin resistance, and development of type 2 diabetes. So this I think is sufficient to tell about all this metabolic endotoxemia. The same thing I am saying here, that where the insulin resistance, you can see the associated fecal metabolites are associated with altered gut microbiota and microbial genetic functions. This has been shown in many new studies. In the same way, the associated fecal metabolites are associated with altered gut microbiota and even the microbial genetic functions. So let us see the film of this gut microbiota now. The dysbiosis and homeostasis, the decreased insulin sensitivity, increased insulin resistance and many other things depending. So first thing you remember about the dietary fibers, bile acids, histidine and BC branched amino acids, and this depends on your all the pattern of lifestyle. With that, what happens if there is lipopolysaccharides activates the receptor TLR4. In the same way, short chain fatty acid activates what you have showing there, and the bile, and all leading to either insulin sensitivity or insulin resistance increase. So you can see here that is a clear-cut pattern of the microbiota influence on the glucose homeostasis. And there is lots of mechanisms here being shown. And suppose a patient you are giving more and more recommended dietary fiber on the fasting plasma glucose, it has been shown that dysbiosis of the gut microbiota is known to affect the production of the short chain fatty acids, altering the bile acid profile, and endocannabinoid system causing a reduction in GLP-1, GLP-2, glucagon-like peptide 1 and 2 and PYY, that is peptide YY. So an impaired gut barrier and pave the way for a cascade of events that lead to decreased insulin sensitivity, increased ongoing inflammation, more oxidative stress, and increased steatosis and increased fat mass. So enhanced intestinal lipopolysaccharides permeability in the gut seems to play a central role in the chronic inflammation, contributing to the reduced insulin sensitivity. This is again a very new study. And short chain fatty acid concentrations are altered in type 2 diabetes according to specific investigators. तो सपोज ये नॉलेज हमारे पास है, इसका इम्प्लीकेशन हमको आज क्या है? आज के डेट में 2025 मेरे को पता है कि मेरा गट माइक्रोबायोटा खराब हो गया है, मेरे गट माइक्रोबायोटा को डिसबायोसिस से हमको नॉर्मल आना है. तो क्या अभी आज 2024 में व्हाट वी कैन डू? वी कैन डू सम modifications with FMT, that is the FMT. What is FMT? The fecal microbiota transplant, a treatment that dates back over 1000 years to Chinese practitioners, was first published as a modern therapeutic intervention in 1958. Is the process by which a fecal sample from a healthy individual is transplanted into the gut via enema, nasogastric tube or colonoscopy of a diseased patient. So remember, this is a new era of organ transplant. Fecal microbiota transplant from lean healthy donors has also found to be successful in improving. इसको करने से क्या होता है? इंसुलिन सेंसिटिव हो जाता है. And this has been shown even in the treatment of the obesity and metabolic syndrome. So a very innovative way of targeting to change the composition of intestinal microbiota, and some of my friends at the Asian Institute of Gastro Hyderabad, they are doing it. They have found it very successful. The reduction of the HbA1c, even for the BMI. So this has become a started. This is not a dream. This is becoming day to day a reality. Even this has been shown. I will not go for this. But even if suppose you are doing an everyday physical activity of 60 minutes or 40 minutes, fast walking, running, or some playing, again there is a chain, there is a mechanism why it had been shown that ultimately it is going to give you the good bacteria, good microbiota. I am not going to go to tell you the details, including the high-fat diet you are taking. That also changes your gut microbiota. And even it has been found that in Indian patients, and if you compare with the Danish patient, a certain type of microbiota like Previa, Tola and this Lactobacillus, they predominate. So our predominance of the gut microbiota is different because we are taking more and more carbohydrates, and those who are not taking, that is different. Even you think why there is some people of diabetes developing complications so early, someone is developing so late, what is happening? This again could be chronic micro and macrovascular complications of the diabetes and associated changes in the composition of the gut microbiota. So poorly controlled diabetes leads to chronic complications, and again a role of gut microbiota has come in a big way to play. And again, if you are whatever the anti-diabetic drugs you are writing, metformin and whatever it may be, you see here, metformin use has been shown to promote the growth of various short-chain fatty acid producing healthy bacteria. Metformin use has been associated with an increase in the mucin degrading microbiota. So lots of things in the metformin, what we are getting is through the gut microbiota. In the same way, GLP-1RA data is available, although limited data, but may be associated with decreased dysbiosis with the GLP-1. In the same way, DP4 pattern change the pattern of metabolites linked to carbohydrate, amino acid and nucleic acid metabolism. So again, this is through the gut microbiota. In the same way, the pioglitazone, even the SGLT2 inhibitors, the EMPA immoderate type 2 diabetes related diabetic nephropathy by altering the gut microbiota. Dr. Tripathi sir, I will tell you to comment on this because I found it very interesting. With alpha glucosidase inhibitors, sulfonylurea, no data is available so far and suggests a lack of positive effect on the gut microbiota. How to diagnose that you are suffering from gut dysbiosis? If anything is there in the market, very recently, some people like Super Gut, Decode Bio, taking 10,000 rupees, you can pick the company by just on the internet. They will come to your home, they will collect the fecal sample, they will give you the whole detailed analysis of their score. If it is less than 0, you are unhealthy, 0 score balanced, more than 0 healthy and better. So you can do that. But I am no guidelines has recommended to do that at present. Even I asked the people at the AGI, they told me, oh well, we are using it, but no gastrointestinal guideline or metabolic guidelines or diabetic guidelines say that you should go for that. But maybe what will happen in future, I don't know. And even some people are trying to correlate with the TAMO level in the blood. Although this is a
PM Jha sir, Dr. S.K. Madhukar sir and Dr. Ritesh Kamal sir to kindly come up on the stage as the chairpersons. I request the chairpersons to please introduce the speaker to the gathering.
Professor D.P. Singh and Bhagalpur, both are synonymous almost in all the associations meeting, be it RSDI, be it IMA, be it API, and so many other forums. Professor Singh is always present, he is omnipresent. He was with respiratory medicine, professor and head of the department, just 1 year junior to me, or 2 years, I don't remember exactly.
He is a good orator, has a knowledge of diverse topics, and Professor Singh above all is a nice gentleman. Please hear Professor Singh what he has today.
Thank you, Honorable Chairpersons, for kind words. My regards to my professor, Professor H.K. Singh sir, Dr. Professor K.K. Tripathi coming from Varanasi, saying very good message. All our guests and all the delegates present in this hall. And just after listening to the giants like Dr. K.K. Tripathi, Dr. N.K. Singh and many more, and my topic is diabetic lung disease. Is it a fact or a fiction? You have already seen how Dr. Tripathi narrated you diabetic kidney disease and how the podocytes biology to that diabetic kidney disease, how there is albumin is filter and so on and so forth. Next 15 minutes I will try to know that whether it is a fact that diabetic lung disease exists. And you know that India has got dual burden, already very high burden of diabetes as well as high future burden of diabetes. And the high incidence of conversion rate of Indians observed despite we are young, we have got low BMI, we have got low waist conference, conversion rate is very high from the pre-diabetic to diabetic, maybe more than 18% or so. There is one article, diabetic kidney disease, is it a fact or fiction, in 2019. Diabetes, as you know, that it is a chronic progressive lung disease. Lot of biology are there, lot of these complications are there, but little attention is paid whether the diabetes has got same type of effect as it has got effect upon the heart, it has got effect upon the kidney, it has effect upon the eye, brain, etc., etc. So, this retinopathy, neuropathy, or nephropathy, cardiovascular disease, these we know for years together we are talking about, but nobody talks about whether this diabetes has got impact upon the lung or not. This is mainly because of alveolo-capillary system here is huge, maybe 140 square meter area, and that surface is there. So whatever effect it will have, that will have minimal effect, maybe late effect, that we have, lot of studies are coming up and that shows, yes, it has got impact upon this even if it is large area is there. In some conditions, wherever there will be associated conditions like pneumonia, COPD and other things, or hypoxia will be there, that effect will be there. See this 100% of blood from the right ventricle going to the lung. 100% of oxygenated blood is coming to the lung. So this is a very huge area. So impact is less minimal, subclinically is much more, but in the late effect it has got some effects. And you know diabetic complication, if you search out, lung is nowhere there. As you know that lung is a very vital organ. After heart you have to think about lung, and the corona has proved it that so much of mortality just COVID virus can prove. So we have to pay attention to our lung. What is the pathology? Pathology is microangiopathy. Pathology is neuropathy. Pathology is non-enzymatic glycation of tissue protein, thus rendering the lung a target organ. And lung is a target organ both in microangiopathy, there in both in type 1 and type 2. And evidence of this microangiopathy is thickening of the alveolo-capillary membrane, pulmonary arterial wall, and decreased lung blood flow volume in type 1 diabetes or type 2 diabetes. And there is a random pattern of tissue involvement. Most likely factor for development of abnormal lung, there are the mechanics, lung mechanics, that is alteration of lung connective tissue. Changes in the collagen, the changes in elastin is there, and that causes narrowing of alveolar space, flattening of alveolar epithelium, expansion of the interstitial tissue, and involvement of pulmonary vessels, bronchial epithelium and pulmonary capillaries. And these are, you see, the lung autonomic neuropathy having impact upon the parasympathetic system, impact upon the sympathetic system, and giving rise to abnormal response to central or peripheral stimuli, reduced clearance of this mucociliary clearance. It has got effect upon the phrenic nerve also, giving rise to phrenic nerve neuropathy, and this has got the effect upon the pulmonary function test. And how we do this role of simple lung functions, we can measure in the diabetic patients, and what will be the result? PFT. It has been seen that FEV1 by FVC are significantly lower in diabetic patients as compared to this control. And if you see the normal population, then the diabetic patients, their FEV1 is 71 ml per year average decline. But in the normal population, it is just 21 ml per year. So see the difference, that the FEV1 decline is 2 to 3 times more in the diabetic patients as compared to the normal population. If there is increase of HbA1c, it is also decreases the lung functions parameter, that is FEV1 by FVC ratio. But the better measurement will be diffusion capacity. And the DLCO you should apply in these functions. And the lung function, this causes this marker of deficiency of lung to transfer gas from the inhaled air to the circulating blood parameter. This DLCO is better than the simple lung function test because patient has the compliance in that is very poor. And here just 10 seconds of breath holding that is required. Patient inhale the air, small amount of CO and tracer gas, methane or helium. And DLCO is estimated as a result of reduced DLCO in the diabetic patients maybe less than 40 to 60%. And several studies have proved that this diffusion capacity is decreased in patients of diabetes. And these are the results that you can see, especially the diffusion capacity of CO reduced. This is usually largely homogeneous results are there. And there are this ventilatory response to hypoxia is also decreased. Respiratory muscles, that is responsible for our respiration, that is also, this myopathy is also there because of the diabetes in both in type 1 and type 2 there. And there are certain latest investigations, that is perfusion CT. You can utilize perfusion CT, you can utilize this pulmonary transit of this agitated contrast bubbles. What is this PCTA? Perfusion CT in particular has shown great capability of monitoring changes in CT perfusion parameters, and it is capable of measuring the blood volume, blood flow, mean transit time, time to peak, and permeability surface. In fact, diabetes seems to be associated with an increase in above mentioned perfusion parameters in the lung. And this is a novel echocardiographic biomarker. This is the biomarker which is used to quantify pulmonary transit time of agitated contrast bubble, showing that number of bubbles traversing the pulmonary circulation to reach left ventricle is reduced in patients with diabetes with microvascular complications. So we have to study not only the simple PFT, not only the DLCO, but these are the latest investigation that we should put in that to know the status of this microangiopathy in the patients of diabetes mellitus. But the problem is that the clinical this presentation is very much less. Some clinical presentation is there. We have to think, we have to suspect and put the patients of diabetic patient on these different batches of investigation. See this beautiful, no bubble is there in the A, and the bubble coming from the right side to the lung to the left, this left ventricle. The beautiful bubble, this agitated bubble you can see, and you can see the transit time while less bubble is coming. You can see the capillary flow in the lung is very much reduced. So, but what we see, there are many diseases in the lung, and there the impact is very, very high. That we are obviously seeing here. This is the age where the OSA is very much common. Pulmonary hypertension is there. Idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, that we are seeing much more diagnosis is done by CT and this HRCT. Here, there also, you can visualize what the diabetes can change in that. And before that, we can see the hypoglycemia. That is the feature. Hypoglycemia can propose this RHO associated, that is ROC pathway, this airway hyperresponsiveness. Hyperglycemia that can also increase the lung fibrosis. it can increase the lungs cancer growth and many other inflammatory pathways, this NOx pathway, this reactive nitrogen species and other things. This high glucose level concentration in the airway surface liquid, that is called ASR, and the lung immune system, that is causes hyperglycemia, promoting susceptibility to pulmonary infections. Normally, whatever we talk about the diabetes and lung, we talk about the tuberculosis. We talk about the pneumonia, that this diabetes can promote lung infections, pneumonia, but it also promotes many other diseases that you can see. One of this is the mechanism, starting from airway hyperresponsiveness, starting this fibrosis by this transcription pathway or connective tissue growth factor or this transforming growth factors, and this reactive oxygen response, malignancy, inflammatory cytokine, inflammation, oxidative stress, and lastly the infection. So all parts of diseases, this hyperglycemia can affect. Similarly, the insulin also, whether this insulin is endogenous or exogenous, can have many effects upon our respiratory system, whether it is the Th2, activation giving rise to more of the bronchial asthma, or the mast cell degradation, inflammatory macrophages, and other things. So this diabetic nephropathy again is a research. There's many cases of idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis we are coming in our clinical practice. And what is the cause? The association of diabetes and idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis has been seen. So whether this diabetes is causing more of this, one of the entities is called diabetes-induced idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. So that is one of the subset of the idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis that can induce. And the mechanism is said that hyperglycemia can give rise to this DNA damage. Repair is there, but damage is much more, and that senescence is there, more of pulmonary fibrosis is there. So these are all the diseases, whether it is bronchial asthma or COPD or lung cancer or ARDS, pulmonary hypertension, idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, OSA, diabetic drugs, pneumonia and tuberculosis, all are affected by diabetes. This is obvious. There are so many reports, and this is clinically proved that we have to take care of this, all the obvious diseases that we see. Similarly, it's bronchial asthma, especially in type 1 diabetes, may be controversial, but type 2, it is said that T2DM, obesity, may increase the risk of asthma 2 to 3 times. Obesity decreases the effectiveness of asthma therapy, and the mechanisms have been shown. COPD again, it is said that diabetes increases not only the severity of the COPD, but also the hospital stay, and the outcome may be affected by diabetes mellitus. And early in 2010 demonstrated higher incidence of COPD in diabetic patients with higher body mass index. Similarly, the pulmonary function test in diabetic patients with more than 10 packed years of smoking is reduced compared to that the non-diabetic patients. Hyperglycemia upon presentation to the ICU is associated with poor outcome. So this metformin is said to be reduces the risk factor of case mortality in patients with coexisting diabetes mellitus. डायबिटीज का मरीज को लंग कैंसर का खतरा ज़्यादा. So a meta-analysis of observed says that higher incidence of lung cancer in diabetic women. Recently it showed also the higher risk of lung cancer in diabetic patients with poor glycemic control. Hyperglycemia may increase the cell survival and proliferation and related to insulin and insulin-like growth factors. So DM and acute lung injury, that is also associated, and many studies have shown that T2 and T1 DM prevent the development of ARDS in patients predisposing with the ARDS risk factors. These vessels, pulmonary vessels that are there in these lungs, and the Greenman reviewed the possible mechanism that DM-induced pulmonary hypertension based on the existing research, and there are many reduced endothelin, nitric oxide synthetase activity and other things. And but the effect of this pulmonary hypertension may increase the mortality rate if the DM is present along with the pulmonary hypertension. Pulmonary fibrosis, I have already told you that aging is a very important contributor both in DM and pulmonary fibrosis, and if this IPF is very common, increasing possibility that lifestyle-related disease like DM or obesity may affect the initiation and progression of pulmonary fibrosis. And alveolar epithelial cells and endothelial capillary basal lamina are significantly thicker in diabetic patients than the control. And this DM-induced pulmonary fibrosis, again you can see microangiopathy also plays the part, and the fibrosis occurs and giving rise to inflammation is also there, giving rise to pulmonary orthopathy. The Japanese case control study showed DM increases the risk of development of PF. A case control study from UK found also association of IPF and DM, which is a strong association being with the insulin use. OSA is very much in the picture, very much in the discussion. OSA also affects this 2 to 25% global population. It's a very strong risk of both diabetes and there. And everybody talked about the sleep apnea giving rise to insulin resistance, giving rise to diabetic mellitus, and giving rise to a lot of complications of that. And there are many data, many studies that show cystic fibrosis, that is also most common life-threatening complication. DM could be the risk factors in that also. And DM is the presentation outcome also because of pancreatic insufficiency. There are many infective agents are there. Whether the hypoglycemic agents has got relationship with the lung disease. Metformin improves survival in the lung cancer patients, improves survival in the lung infections. So metformin again is very much important. Insulin has got high prevalence of lung cancers. We have already talked about that. And there are many relationships. Even this SGLT2 inhibitor is said to induce pulmonary arterial smooth muscle relaxations. Could be maybe of useful in pulmonary hypertension also. So risk between diabetes and pneumonia or diabetes and tuberculosis, everyone is aware of that, and it has been reported that pneumonia has got the greatest prevalence and incidence and severity with the elevated this HbA1c. So high rate of lung infections in diabetic patients are there, and there are many about it. Statin, you know that it is very much used in diabetic mellitus, is said to prevent the respiratory infection in persons with diabetic mellitus, maybe due to the immune modulation. Diabetes and this tuberculosis, you know that there is diabetes increasing 2 to 3 times of incidence of tuberculosis, and even the development of tuberculosis maybe initially can give rise to hyperglycemia. This is the two-way pathway in that, and we know for sure that this diabetic and the tuberculosis combination gives rise to atypical presentation, more serious presentation, and if the HbA1c is more than 30, more than 10 or more, we must use insulin. Otherwise, other drugs can be used if it is less than that. But the control of diabetes is very, very important. If we want to treat and cure the tuberculosis patients, it can increase both in the decompression sensitive as well as decompression resistant cases. Healing harmony shows the positive effect of diabetic control, lung diffusion capacity, and see the exercise doing that, and it can has that positive impact. So to conclude, despite emerging clinical reports on the diabetic lung, we young physicians, young respiratory physicians, young diabetologists, all these chairpersons are there, very young and enthusiastic. We have to take this diabetes-induced pulmonary disorders. Studies should be carried out in Bihar and our patients, and to prove that how much impact of this diabetes is going to give on this microangiopathy and other things. Targeting multiple risk factors associated with DM is essential to curbing the growing incidence and progression of diabetes pulmonary complications. Clinical and experimental studies are needed to better understand the lung disease process in diabetic patients in order to improve the medical management and prevention of pulmonary complications. From public health perspective, early treatment of this lung comorbidities in patients with diagnosed and undiagnosed, because you see in our patients, undiagnosed DM is very much high. DM has got a very strong potential to improve the quality of life and survival. And lastly, good glycemic control of diabetic patients are very much required to treat and prevent the pulmonary effect of diabetes complications. Thank you very much, and before I end, कुछ बात है कि हस्ती मिटती नहीं हमारी, कुछ बात है कि हस्ती मिटती नहीं हमारी, दुश्मन दौड़े जहां हमारा, सदियों दुश्मन रहा है, सदियों दौड़े जहां हमारे, सारे जहां से अच्छा हिंदुस्तान हमारा, सारे जहां से अच्छा दरभंगा हमारा, उनका से लाइक दैट. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for very lucid talk on a topic that is very interesting, and you have nicely convinced that diabetic lung disease is not a fiction, it is likely to be a fact. How the diabetic pathogenesis and the mechanism of diabetes affect the lung health, it is now a matter of deep study, but it is already proven that diabetes can change the whole profile of the disease or may lead to some de novo pulmonary diseases. So it's a very interesting topic, and I am thankful that you dealt it in very nicely.
Yeah. Before we open this session for the questions, being chairpersons, I believe I have the luxury to text you 2 minutes. And I would thank RSSDI Bihar for inviting core pulmonologist to the desk, which is happening for the first time in the state, I believe. And I congratulate Dr. Manish for organizing such a wonderful event. And I believe it will go with me deep in my heart. So I open this session for the questions, and if anyone has the query, please.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Okay. Because of the lack of the time, we are not inviting any queries. Thank you so much.
Just 1 minute. Before we close the session, with due permission from the organizers, I would just like to invite all of you to a seminar cum workshop on the 30th of this month at Patna Gyan Bhavan, and the topic is sleep related.
For the last session of the conference, but in no way the least, I request Dr. Siddharth sir, Dr. Rajesh sir and Dr. Bharat sir to kindly come up on the stage as the chairpersons of the session. The topic is time restriction eating and its effect on diabetes mellitus. I request our chairpersons to kindly invite and introduce the speaker to the gathering.
Dr. Milen Jha, who is also assistant professor at Madhubani Medical College, is a young, budding, dynamic physician of Darbhanga. His topic for today is the restriction diet and its effect on diabetes. Please continue.
Thank you so much for the introduction, sir. For any introduction, I'd just like to quote Shri Harivansh Rai Bachchan ji, मिट्टी का तन मस्ती का मन क्षण भर जीवन मेरा परिचय. And I think that is a quintessential identity of everyone here. So I'll start with the blessings of my seniors, with a prayer to the Almighty. I'll start my presentation. Time restricted eating, does it restrict diabetes? So the agenda is very clear. We'll define TRE, why it is so popular, the types, its effect on diabetes, and further on. So I'm proud to belong to a nation that knows the unknown, that has shown the world what is spirituality, but nonetheless it is also a nation which shows the world what is science. And science is now gradually finding truth in our Vedic and old teachings. So this is a map of India where this straight line is 79° east longitude, and all the major Shivalingas, Shiv temples, are on this longitude, which goes through Sumeru Parvat, which was first mentioned by Varahamihir in his Surya Siddhant of astronomy. This is the land where the Ujjain Vedshala stairs lie right above the axis of the earth. This is a land of engineers where sophisticated monolithic largest designs are shown, which still cannot be explained with modern engineering tools. This is the land which gave the anatomical human being much before Da Vinci did. This is the land which has explained time to its minute details. This simple Konark wheel and the Konark wheel in the Konark temple tells us what to do at what part of the day. So this is the land which has first and since centuries been practicing time-restricted eating. So time-restricted eating, popularly known as intermittent fasting, is an eating pattern characterized by alternating but defined periods of fasting and eating. It has been in various formats followed in multiple communities and cultures all over the world, primarily for religious reasons. Fasting in modern medicine had been also advocated by Hippocrates when he wrote, "To eat when you are sick is to feed your illness." And Paracelsus, was one of the founders of toxicology and one of the fathers of modern medicine, wrote, "Fasting is the greatest remedy, the physician within." We are at RSSDI, and I'd like to talk about Dr. Elliot Proctor Jocelyn, was the founder of the Jocelyn Institute in USA. He promoted fasting before the advent of insulin in diabetic patients and attracted a lot of controversy, as some patients had also succumbed to the so-called starvation diet. So why is it so popular? As you can see it on the picture on the right side, there are multiple pharmacological advances in treatment of obesity and diabetes as of date. The disease burden still keeps rising. So more interest in dietary changes has again come up. Multiple diet approaches have been tried over the last few decades and they tend to fail. More recent scientific advances in understanding of processes involving with fasting has come up, and added benefits of intermittent fasting, especially its potential beneficial effects on diseases, moods, cognition and life expectancy has kicked off this popularity with intermittent fasting. So there are three broad types of intermittent fasting. One is the alternate day fasting, which has one feast day and one fast day. Fast day does not mean you don't eat anything. The calorie requirement is somewhere around 0 to 500 calories. There is this 5:2 diet, which is I think most popular in India, where you fast for 2 days, say maybe on 2 defined days, and you can eat on the other 5 days. And the other one is what we know as the typical time restricted eating, where there is an eating window and a fasting window on a daily basis. There are some variations. Now this fasting, this 5:2 diet is a type of up-down diet. So the up days are where you eat and the down days are where you don't eat. And there are modifications of that 4:3, 3:4, etc. Periodic fasting involves less frequent but longer periods of fasting. Example, 1 to 5 day pure water fast, or a 4 to 7 day fasting simulated diet designed to mimic the metabolic effects of fasting. For example, a Navratri diet could be modified to become a mimic fast diet. The P2 regimen is where you have just 2 meals, mostly no dinner. And the OMAD diet is pretty popular nowadays. It is a more severe form of intermittent fasting. The caloric consumption happens in one meal, although the same meal can be consumed over a few hours and not at a time. Intermittent, very low calorie diet therapy, it was talked about by Dr. A.K. Das yesterday. It is not true intermittent fasting, as the subject consumes the calories throughout the day and there is no defined fasting periods here. So caloric deficit eating strategies have been defined into 2 basic types. One is continuous calorie restriction, which is a part of different diets, and intermittent fasting, which we have already discussed as what are the subtypes here. There are 1 or 2 important terminologies that I would emphasize on, and we'll talk about it later, and that is one, early and late time restricted eating, isocaloric versus calorie restricted. So this is the basic understanding of insulin resistance in diabetes, especially type 2 diabetes. We already know that. These are the various areas where the different organs are affected by insulin resistance. But what we generally tend to forget, we advise our patients about lifestyle modifications, but we don't really give that much amount of thought to the diet that the patient is consuming, because we are in overloaded state with a number of patients and much less time to be given to them. So in earlier ages, when we were metabolically active, when we were hunters and hunter-gatherers, long back in the track of evolution, we were able to consume and metabolize whatever was available to us. But with time, the hunter-gatherers become agriculturists, and there was an industrial revolution, and the load of ultra-processed foods, high glycemic load and high glycemic value with high fructose load, and food with high fructose corn syrup has risen by multiple folds over the last few decades. And hence our bodies are not able to cope up. They are evolutionarily prehistoric, and the load that is being given is immense. And as a result of which, in today's world, we have the youngest type 2 diabetic was reported by Texas Hospital in 2015, and he was just 3 years old. That is the consensus, that is the situation we are dealing with. So modern life is an embarrassment of riches, and our prehistoric bodies are unable to cope with them. So as you can see, there was a high glycemic load or a high fructose and high fructose corn syrup load, which gives rise to metabolic overload and hyperinsulinemia, finally leading to insulin resistance. And this forms a vicious cycle which we cannot overcome. So the big question here is that in an hyperinsulinemic state, like for example in type 2 diabetes, giving insulin
of caring for patients from all walks of life. Each patient brings a unique story and set a challenge, and it is my duty to listen, empathize, and provide the best possible care. From comforting newly diagnosed diabetic patients to guideline individuals through the complexity of, and I have witnessed the transformative power of hormonal balance. Every success story fuels my passions for endocrinology and diabetology and reaffirms my commitment to making a positive impact on the lives of others. Beyond the confines of my clinic, I champion initiative aimed at raising awareness and combating the stigma around diabetes. I collaborated with community organizations, participated in public health campaigns, and advocate for policy reform to improve areas access to care. As I reflect on my life's work, I am humbled by lives I have touched and the lives that have touched mine. Though the path has been fraught with challenge, the moments of triumph have made it all worthwhile. My journey as a diabetologist is not just a career, it is a testament to the power of compassion, privilege, and human connection. As I look back on my journey, I am filled with gratitude for the opportunity that have shaped me into the diabetologist that I am today, from humble beginning to fulfilling my childhood dream. The path has challenging yet immensely rewarding. Looking ahead, I am excited to continue my pursuit of excellence in diabetes, striving to improve the lives of my patients and contribute to the ever-evolving landscape of medical science. With each new day comes the opportunity to make a difference, and I am honored to be a part of this noble preparation. Thank you. If chairperson allow me for a few minutes, I can share few stories from AIIMS where I work there.
No, I will allow you that, and on top of that, I am quite sure that under your leadership, our RSSDI Bihar chapter will grow more and more.
Thank you, sir.
Kindly share your anecdotes and also the vision which you have for us.
Thank you. Can I go?
Okay. You please share your vision and your anecdotes, sir, please. Please.
जब मैं एम्स में काम कर रहा था, मेरे गाइड पंकज शाह, तो मैं MMS आहूजा के बारे में सुना था. At that time he was retired professor of medicine and तो उन्होंने उनके अंडर में उन्होंने DM किया था. तो मुझे लगा आहूजा के बारे में सुनने के बाद उनसे मिलना चाहिए.
रैंडमली मैं 1 महीना वर्क करने के बाद सीताराम भारतीय इंस्टीट्यूट में उस समय वो डायरेक्टर थे, मैं ऐसे ही चला गया उनके पास। तो उन्होंने पूछा कि तुम क्यों आए हो मेरे पास, कोई परिचय नहीं था, कुछ नहीं था। मैं कहा सर आपसे मिलने आया हूँ, आपके बारे में सुना था। तो कहा किसने बताया? मैं बताया पंकज शाह योर स्टूडेंट। तो उस समय तो उन्होंने कुछ नहीं बोला, बोला तुम इवनिंग में मेरे लाइब्रेरी में आओ। तो मैं उनके पास गया, बहुत सारा डिस्कशन किए। उन्होंने उस दिन इंस्ट्रक्ट किया, आफ्टर फिनिशिंग योर वर्क इन इवनिंग एट एम्स यू कम्स टू माई इंस्टीट्यूट एवरी डे और एज यू विश। तो उस डे से उन्होंने आना जाना उनके पास शुरू किया। और one day he gave me some important paper to hand over to Pankaj Shah, my guide. So I hand over simply the paper. Next day, तो पंकज शाह ने बोला तुम्हें किसने दिया? हम कहे आहूजा सर ने दिया। तो उन्होंने कुछ बताया नहीं उस दिन। उस दिन से मेरे साथ वो काफ़ी वार्ड में क्लिनिकल सेटिंग में काम करने लगे, इंस्ट्रक्ट करने लगे। और आफ्टर 15 days he gave me a envelope to hand over the आहूजा। तो मैंने एज इट इज मैंने उन्होंने हैंड ओवर कर दिया। नेक्स्ट डे वो पेपर मेरे साथ है। उन्होंने जो पेपर दिया तो एक सर्टिफिकेट के रूप में, टू whom ever it may concern. Dr. Ajay Kumar has been working as a trainee in the Department of Endocrinology. I was introduced to Dr. Kumar because he expressed keen interest in learning the skills of diabetes management. Dr. Kumar has been regularly attending the endocrinology and metabolic clinics and the diabetes of care clinic of AIIMS ever since. His interaction with me during the clinics and the ward round when I was on ward duty made his eagerness to learn apparent. Dr. Kumar, I am sure, will make into a good diabetes doctor given the right opportunity to work. I wish him the very best for his work in diabetes, especially and life in death.